So here we have yet another break episode. Although this one's a little bit different than some of the previous break episodes because it's a little more serious. It's still got its humor element, mostly with the whole, post office side plot. Which, of course, reaches a humorously ironic conclusion, as per the norm. I do like the inclusion of that little subplot, actually. In addition to the humor factor, which, is something Garibaldi's very good at in general, it makes a lot of sense. It's the kind of thing that should be in a show like this one. Too many shows, looking at you, Star Trek, tend to just kind of assume the backing and support that is required to maintain something like a station or a ship is just there. Even Voyager, when it literally did not have that backing and support, was written to just kind of presume it was there. And very rarely was it actually a relevant thing on that show. But here, we see that docking fees are mentioned, and rate hikes are happening because they're cut off from their supply network, and they have to build a new one. In fact, this is actually kind of normal in real-life terms. Let's say some kind of revolution happens, some colony breaks off. Everything kind of goes bad immediately, because all of a sudden all of the things that were there previously are gone. That being said, of course, that's a temporary thing usually, because what has to happen then is they have to build a new support network in terms of supplies and connections and trade and backing, all those sort of intangible things and tangible things that help provide for a society, for a civilization. So I like that they acknowledge that at several points throughout this episode, especially the creation of the Babylon Treaty, which is something that will be significant in the future as well. But I really do like that establishment of, we know you guys are at war, but we're neutral territory, and we might need help defending ourselves, and we're a very well-positioned trade hub, and that's true. I've actually mentioned this before, how Babylon 5 is, in terms of placement, it is probably one of the most well-positioned stations in the setting at this point in history. It is at a confluence of hyperspace routes, and is pretty much... they've never really given an official map, but it's implied many times, and most of the fan maps tend to agree based on information in the show. It's basically smack dab in the middle of everything, equidistance from all the major powers. So it's very, very valuable position. It is a trade hub, if nothing else. It's the Constantinople, sorry. Or Istanbul, if you prefer. I don't know. Whichever. Point being, I like that they use that positioning and their own situation to basically make this new treaty situation. And I like the post office thing. I also like this line that I have to laugh at. We've fought against two carrier groups, and we've broken away from the Earth Alliance, and the guy says, "Yeah, but this is the post office. This could get us in real trouble." I really liked that line. I don't have much to say about that, the rest of that. This episode also does do a good job of adding more into the blanks. I tend to forget on repeat viewings that even as of now, halfway through Season 3, we don't know the full extent of the information that went into the Minbari Earth War. Because they've been kind of revealing it bit by bit. We know about the Battle of the Line, of course. We know about Dukat. We know kind of the involvement of certain characters involved therewith. But what we don't know is the mistake thing. At least I think so. I'm pretty sure this is the first time they mentioned the mistake. The ports. The fact that Earth started the war as a result of a tragic and horrible misunderstanding. A snake. A sword. Very appropriate metaphor, if I'm being honest. And it really adds some weight to the situation. I have a note down here that war sucks. This is one of the most universally recognized human truths right here. War sucks. I think we all know that to some extent or another. But what I like is how Babylon 5 continues to go down to a personal level and show you an individual who was destroyed, not killed, destroyed as a result of that war, that one conflict. Keeping in mind that we have already seen another war in the course of this show, the Narn Centauri War. And, well, I don't think this is spoiling too much, but there's the Shadow War is coming. It's in the frickin' intro, for God's sakes. So I like how Babylon 5 continues to try its best to have a war story that does not step over the line into glorifying war. I'm trying to think of how best to describe this, because there's really only two perspectives you can take on a war story, my opinion, as a writer. You can do the Warcraft route. Now, Warcraft has done its fair share of showing how absolutely terrible war can be, too. But Warcraft is still a very, very romanticized setting. It is actually one of the things I like about that setting. The Warcraft setting is idealized. It's romanticized. I kind of already said that. So in there, war is epic, powerful, charging armies, But that doesn't work for everything. And JMS himself went on record as saying that he really didn't want to go that route with Babylon 5. He wanted to show pretty much the exact opposite of that. And so I like how the show goes out of its way to remind you, and has been doing so for several episodes across the 3 seasons, just hammering that point in of just how bad war is. Not just in the obvious duh way, but in a way that we, individuals, can comprehend. I'm reminded of the sniper from... I don't remember the name of the episode all of a sudden. It was just a couple episodes ago. The gentleman who was diseased in the mind, who took 7 days to kill a Membari by slowly chopping off his limbs and digits one by one. As I mentioned in that episode, work was done there to try and make it seem like he was just a psychopath, but at the same time, it was also presented as though maybe there was something that just was broken in him as a result of the war. Remember, he was the kind of person who was behind enemy lines. That's horrible in any circumstance. So, what we see here is kind of the opposite of that. We see a person who was destroyed as a result of being involved in that war, of basically starting that war. There's this great line where Dr. Franklin says, you were absolved in court of all of that, which I found so hilariously naive to say that. Like someone from some kind of officials or judges can sit down and write down on a piece of paper, you're innocent, and that's suddenly the truth. As if that matters at all in reality, which is where our good friend ironically lived. Of course he would volunteer for the Battle of the Line. In fact, I've actually talked about this recently, too, with Marcus. Marcus, of course, sympathizes perfectly with Arthur, or David, if you prefer. How dare I survive? How dare this stain on humanity, who started all this mess, who was the one who fired the cannons, who obeyed orders, and started a war of genocide. How dare he survive? And I phrased my sentence there very carefully, because that's probably exactly what went through David's mind. How dare I survive? And then the trauma of it just pushed him further away until it was how dare he survive, moving himself away from it. I'm reminded of the gunner on the Death Star, actually. It's probably one of my favorite aspects, and it gets me every time I rewatch A New Hope. When there's the gentleman saying, as the final trench run is happening, there's a guy saying, stand by, stand by. That's the gunner, the guy who actually pushed the button that destroyed Alderaan, and who was traumatized and horrified at what he'd done. And in the end there, the gun was ready to fire. Like, they were ready to go well before Luke actually finished the trench run. Obviously, this is EU, so, whatever. Luke was already... They were ready to go. They were ready to destroy Yavin 4, and that was going to be the end of it. But he's just there, and he's, like, inside his head, he's just praying, please, anything stop me from doing this again. Anything at all. God, please. And he's just saying stand by because he can't... He's locked. He can't think of anything else to do. He has no power to stop this from happening again. And then, of course, the trench run was successful. I very much love that, and it adds even more weight to an already incredible scene. But that's what I'm reminded of here. The blood of Alderaan is on Tarkin's hands. Really, it is. And that's even in reality. Let's ignore legality for a second. In reality, that's Tarkin. That's all on Tarkin. And the tragic misunderstanding that led to the Earth-Minbari War, that's actually on several people's hands, really, when you think about it. And I'm not going to go into the specifics, but, I mean, the Minbari have some blame there. The captain has some blame there. It was a pretty bad situation. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm the one pulling the trigger. I'm the one pushing the button. I am the tip of the spear. You may be the one guiding the spear, but I'm the one who actually penetrates the enemy and kills them. And there is a certain detached horror to that. And then, of course, he volunteers at the Battle of the Line and lives. Franklin himself gives the numbers, I forget it, but it's like less than 200 survived that battle. Almost all of the Earthers who were involved in the Battle of the Line died. And yet of all those people and all those deaths, all that absolution, who lived? It's no wonder that, while he might have been recovering to some extent up in that point, until that point, surviving through that was probably even worse. But I don't think that's when he snapped. I personally think he snapped when the truth came out. When the two sides started talking and coordinating, and it became known that the Minbari, that it was an accident, that it was this stupid, ridiculous, tragic mistake. And all of a sudden he realizes that all of those people died for nothing. They weren't fighting some holy war. They weren't fighting against some oppressive, dictatorial Nazis or whatever. It was a cultural misunderstanding that went way out of the way. And it's funny. Because, well, that's very Minbari, isn't it? The Minbari tend to go all out when they do things like this. It's probably one of the reasons why Delenn, without hesitation, agreed to be the Lady of the Lake for him. Not just because of her own guilt in the situation. As we know, she was kind of personally involved in the Minbari human war more than once. More than that, though, she is a Minbari. They kind of revere that concept of individuals of import, historical value based on names or legends. As I mentioned back in the episode where she basically talked her way into the council, even though she was being barred from it, she did so by calling on Minbari beliefs, Minbari significance. Hence, why she would probably put some weight into Arthur. It's funny because, actually, there's 3 people in this episode who tend to revere Arthur, in the case of this. One is Marcus, that's kind of obvious, really, when you think about it. But then one is Jakar, and one is Delenn. I've always been left with this strange interpretation that the aliens, in this case, the non-humans, I should say, have less, for lack of a better term, jaded cynicism about them when it comes to things that, like that. For example, let me give you an example. I want you to presume for a moment that this is real life. I know it's hard, but bear with me. And Arthur shows up. The romanticized Arthur, like he's portrayed in this episode. Not any of the other versions of Arthur, or arguably the real versions of Arthur, which were all terrible, horrible people, but the romanticized, the knight of legend who was honorable and just and good, okay? That guy shows up. Now, is anybody going to believe he's Arthur? Of course not. I wouldn't either. But it is my honest opinion, and I may be straying just a little bit into the controversy box here, but it is my honest opinion that most of that is because we have become jaded as a species, because so many people have shown up taking advantage of the idealism that would lead to us thinking, well, maybe. And I mean that sincerely. It's a form of escalation. To explain what I mean a little bit better, let's assume, just fictional situation, okay? Here's humanity. And someone shows up and says, I am Arthur, okay? Well, they're lying. Because what they're actually doing is trying to take advantage of people. They're an outlier in the situation who is pushing the envelope. So people are like, okay, now our overall cultural attitude toward this has escalated only a little bit, but it's the point now where like next time we're going to be a little more skeptical, right? Well, then someone else tries it, and then someone else tries it, and then a few hundred more people, and a few thousand more people, and it gets to the point where we as human beings, as a species, have seen so many people claiming to be these things that at this point, I will freely admit it is possible that out there in this 7 billion people, someone out there might be an Arthur-type situation, the fantastical, in other words, more than the mundane. But I have absolutely no way of knowing that, do I? Because so many people have spent so much time lying about it, either because they are, like poor David was, destroyed, or because they're trying to take advantage of people, or because they just think it's funny for the lulz. So the idea of someone who is actually truthfully fantastical is possible, but immensely unlikely. Now, add a Minbari mindset to that. How many times do the Minbari do that kind of thing? How many times has a Minbari said, I am Valen reborn? Well, none. From everything we've heard and everything I know about the setting, taking the whole show and the comics and everything else I've read, no one has ever come out saying, I am Valen. There's never been that kind of falsehood. So they don't have even that first step of skepticism. So it makes sense that in that sort of innocence, in that sort of innocent environment, they would look at him and say, oh, of course he's Arthur. There's no reason to doubt it. No, he's not. At least he's not the old Arthur. But that leads to the kind of gray situation here, because David was a good man. Everything indicates that. Arthur is also a good man. And he is, like I said, the romanticized version of Arthur. He has taken a legend and tried to live up to that ideal and tried to be a good person. We see this most clearly when he goes out of his way to go into a fight where he is outnumbered and, frankly, should have probably lost, to help a woman get a picture of her husband back. That's Mario levels of idealism right there. It's not actually the Mario, but it's entering that category. That's like the Link levels just before Mario, So it's not like he's a bad person. What I mean by this, then, is that even though he is not Arthur, he could be David. New legend, new ideal, new concept. And given the fact that he ends up going to Narn in the end to help lead the real resistance against the real threats of the real Centauri with the real Narn, he may literally become a new legend. Which is interesting to think about, because that could never happen here. Could it? And again, I admit I am just as much a part of the problem here as anybody else is. I have just as much jaded cynicism as anybody else does. I've seen liars in my life. Actually, being 100% honest, I still have a problem understanding that other people might be lying to me. I know that sounds weird, but I am the kind of person who my first assumption is that if you tell me something, you're telling the truth. I have to usually mentally adjust and be like, hang on, let me fact check that really quick before I go forward with that. And I don't always remember to do that. And even I would look at the situation and say, oh, buzz off. I also have a question for you. I actually have it towards the end of my notes here, but I just mentioned it, so I want to talk about it now. First of all, it's nice to see that the human-Narn bonds are growing even stronger. The more we see of the humans and Narn interacting together, the more you can see why those two races gel surprisingly well together. And I think the Narns, and to an extent the humans, are starting to see that too. Lord knows Jakar has grown a tremendous amount of respect for the humans, at least a few individual humans, and for the concepts they can bring to the Narn. But I have a question for you. Who goes to Narn? Is it David, or is it Arthur? If you pay attention, I've always assumed it was Arthur, but when I rewatched this episode for this rumination just a few minutes ago, I realized they never said. They never said who it is that's going to Narn. And I realized that the way it's presented, it could be either. And I like that, because now it's up to us to decide who goes to the Narn homeworld to become this new revolution leader, to probably die, let's be honest with ourselves, but to nevertheless help to inspire and lead and coordinate the Narn resistance against the Centauri oppression. I personally, now that I've rewatched it and analyzed it with analysis mode on, I think it was David that went back to Narn. I shouldn't say back, went to Narn to help lead that resistance. Two reasons I think that. One, the way he is so grateful to the Doctor. The way he's like, oh, thank you very much, Doctor. There's a lot of sincerity in the way he gives him his gratitude. And he doesn't need to talk or act any different to be different. He is Michael York, after all. He is a person who's going to speak basically the same way either way, and I've got a note about that I'll talk about in a second. But the second reason I think it's David is because that fits better narratively. Again, a new legend. This is the man who has come to grips with how horrible the things that have happened to him are, and now he has a chance to do something. Now, his living, how dare I survive, that thought now has a purpose, because now he knows why he survived. Whether you believe in any concept of fate or otherwise is irrelevant. For example, I don't believe in fate personally in real life, but I do firmly believe in purpose. I believe that, for example, if I'm to go through some nightmarish hell with kidney stones, I'm not doing that so I could go on to live a terrible life. I'm doing that for a reason, so that I could go on to live a real life, have some purpose in my life. That's how I think of things. And that's what I think David is thinking now. Yes, I endured. Yes, I survived. And it was terrible that so many others died when I lived. But now it meant something. Now I can go and actually do something about it. And I love that idea. So I've gotten way off topic with my notes here. I'm just going to wrap up a little bit here. First of all, Michael York, great job as Arthur and David in this episode. There's actually not a lot of variance between the two, and I like that, as weird as that sounds, because that's kind of the point. This is not a situation like, oh God, I can't think of the characters' names, like Brad Dourif was playing in Passing Through Gethsemane, where he was playing two extremely different characters who happened to be just different personalities of the same individual. No, he is playing someone who himself is playing someone. So the variance between Arthur and David is almost minuscule, and that's on purpose. That makes sense, because David was a good man, as I mentioned, and Arthur was just an ideal. I like the speech patterns. I mentioned I'd talk about that. Franklin flat out says, no, he's not Arthur. And you know how I can tell it? Because his speech patterns, his vocabulary are wrong. Excuse me. And that's great. Speaking as someone who goes out of his way to analyze speech patterns and word choice regularly, it's one of the ways that I can be me. I don't know. I like that they acknowledge that that's a thing. That you can tell that I'm dying, apparently. Oh my goodness. That you can tell a lot about a person by how they speak, by the words they use, and by the structure of the sentences they push out. For example, if you were to analyze my speech, you could tell that my thoughts go about 10,000 times faster than my words. It's why I stumble and stutter so much, and why I have to every now and again catch myself and say, no, that's the wrong word, because I'm thinking so much faster than I'm talking. You can tell that by the way I speak, by the not the tone, but the word choice and the sentence structure that I utilize. So I like that they acknowledge that. That was great. I like the Bantha flu, of course. It is logical that Banthas would be spreading their filth to all other galaxies. But what I really like that is the unfair comment. Marcus saying, I used to think it was horrible that the universe is unfair, but then I thought it would be so much worse if the universe was fair. I love that perspective because at first glance it means, you know, he thinks the universe should change to be fair. But what he's actually meaning is, what if the universe and everything that's happening in it as of now is fair? That this reality we live in is fair. And how much worse that would be. And I tend to agree with that, by the way. Very interesting perspective. Very Marcus. I also want to say one other thing that I love about Marcus. Too often, fiction will present a character and say, here is a badass. I don't mean that there's a badass and that's a bad thing. I actually like badasses in fiction. But what I mean by this is you look at this character, and even the well-done badasses, fiction tends to just romanticize this just a little bit too much. What I like is when fiction shows the cost of being that badass, how much training and effort and work and torture you have to go through to become that good, to be that on the edge, that capable, that competent, that skilled, that smart, whatever. And Marcus, in his discussion about the Minbari training, is a great way of showcasing, you don't want to go through the training I went through. It was horrible. I am an unholy badass, and it was a nightmare to get here. And I like that they acknowledge that and showcase part of the reason why Marcus is as good as he is. And Marcus himself is cognizant enough to recognize that that's not only not for everyone, but probably shouldn't be for everyone. I like how Marcus immediately picks up on the Arthur situation, because we've established already that Marcus is classically literate. That's already been a part of his character arc. In fact, it's actually re-emphasized in this episode. But what I really like is the twist of Arthur's character, in that he's aware of the passage of time. He knows he was on a spaceship, and he knows that it's years since the time of legend. That's a nice twist, because Marcus obviously was assuming he was just a crazy man at first. And then he demonstrates this, and it's like, okay, we'll have to adjust on this one. The other reason I like that is because the Jack the Ripper situation. Marcus, ironically, doesn't have as much of that jaded cynicism that I just talked about. I talked about for however many minutes I did. So for him, the idea that the Vorlons could have actually done this is not out of bounds. And if we're being honest, that is kind of a Vorlon thing to do. Again, Jack the Ripper. They took Jack the freaking Ripper and brought him forward because they thought he could be of use in their particular long-term scheming kind of purposes that the Vorlons tend to do. I like that. Also, quick thing. At the end, Marcus is discussing who each of them would be in Arthurian legend. He stops just short of mentioning who Morgana Le Fay would be. Now, I'm not going to bring down the spoiler box just for this one comment, because I don't feel like it and I've got more stuff to talk about, but even back when even before I started reading up on what the intended foreshadowing was of that line, it occurred to me on second viewing of this show, oh, that's who's supposed to be Morgana. And it's a nice touch. And of course the episode itself kind of calls attention to it by pretty much naming every single one of the characters except her. I like the situation with Shakar. First of all, it shows that Shakar is not only A, bargaining with humans, in a better situation than he was before, really, but B, still working on the resistance back home. But I also like how he comes to observe the situation, and it makes me wonder if he was going to intervene. Because that would be a very Shakar thing to do. Arthur has a quote here that I love, because it has such an obvious answer. What manner of men prey upon the weak and the poor? Well, here's your answer. The weak and the poor. Think about it. I have described the analogy, the anatomy of a bully before. See, I just did it again. I said the wrong term. The anatomy of a bully, and how a bully, as I define it, of course, is ultimately someone who is very weak. Not necessarily weak physically, but weak mentally, weak emotionally, no strong sense of self or core. So they prey upon the weak, who might be weak physically. You get it? And also one of the other big reasons to try and prey upon such people is because you yourself are poor, and therefore desperate, or easy to be pushed around by someone who is weak. It's a great line, because it came to me so immediately. It's like, well, that's a self-explanatory answer. I have to give one small, very, 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 very small nitpick. So I've actually done sword fighting in the past. It's actually something I really wish I had time to get into again. I'm not sure I could anymore with my bad leg. It would probably take some adjustment. But I used to be decent. I would say, decent amateur sword fighter. And the stance that Arthur takes is terrible. I just got to point that out. It's so bad. There's no way he would actually been able to take out those guys with that stance. That being said, one guy with a sword against like 5 guys, one of which has a pipe, If the guy with the sword knows what he's doing, he's winning that fight, even if they all attack at the same time, as usually doesn't happen in fiction. But anyways, and then they're like, I've got friends, and then Jakar just gets into it. I love it. Now, what I love about this is I usually pause the episode, scribble down some notes, and then hit play, okay? So I paused the episode right after Jakar gets into it, and I'm scribbling down, it's very Jakar, and imagine how liberating it must feel to go personally do something. Lord knows Jakar has been helping a lot of people. The humans, he's been helping the Minbari recently, he's been helping his own people back on Narn. He's been doing a lot of good, but not personally. He's an administrator. He's a leader. He is the kind of person who is not in the field. Jakar, if we were to relate him to the captaincies of the Star Trek people, would be very Cisco. He wants to be in the trenches with the rest of his men. And here is a situation he can just jump into and help by himself, and the joy on his face. Katsulas just does a great example of a great examination of exactly how enjoyable this whole situation is for Jakar, and how great it must be to be fighting a clearly defined enemy with no ambiguity. Then I hit on pause, and the next thing he says is, that was great! No moral ambiguity, no hopeless fight against ancient powers. They were the bad guys, we were the good guys, and they made a satisfying thump when they went down. How absolutely liberating that had to feel. Think about it. I personally think Jakar would have very much loved the romanticized version of the Arthurian legend, consequently. Notice how he, again, as I mentioned with the earlier lack of cynicism, takes the whole thing very seriously and straight-faced, and in fact considers it an honor to be dubbed the Red Knight. Granted, he was a little drunk when that happened, but credit where credit is due. This is actually a really good episode. Despite being a breather episode, it hits several things very much on the head. It is very emotional. It is very tightly connected, very personal. And I think this is probably one of the strengths of many episodes of Babylon 5, because it sits and breathes on its guest star in this case. Now, I like Michael York. I make no hesitation about that. Even though he was in Logan's Run, I can forgive that. I'm sorry, I'm not a huge fan of Logan's Run, the movie. But the ideas of Logan's Run, certainly, but not the actual movie. But he nails it. He absolutely nails it. He does do a couple things a little bit too hammy, in the interest of fairness, but a lot of the emotional strength of the scene comes from the simple gravity with which he carries himself. And I'm not just saying that because he's British. Lord knows we here in the States tend to assume anyone who's speaking with a British accent is automatically more stat, surely. But no, he actually does carry himself very well in this episode. And I like that. I actually have talked about this over on Voyager, too, how one of the biggest strengths a television show can have is to have really good guest stars, and how a great guest star can elevate an otherwise bad episode. In fact, just recently I had looked at a Voyager episode called Inside Man, in which Dwight Schultz, God, that took me a moment, Dwight Schultz, who plays Barclay, basically made what would otherwise be a meh episode pretty damn good, because great guest star. So, definite props to this one. Next week, the Shadow War begins. So, we've had our breather, we've had our break. Time to get back into the thick of things, guys. I'll see you around.